Ever wondered what happens when love takes a backseat to politics? Can you imagine being married off before you even hit puberty? What would you do if your wedding day was actually the beginning of your worst nightmare? Number 11. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the twice-married queen. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't just any medieval woman. She was the most eligible bachelorette of the 12th century, controlling vast lands in what is now France. When she was just 15, her father died, making her suddenly the most sought-after heiress in Europe. King Louis VI of France wasted no time. Within hours of her father's death, he arranged for his 17-year-old son, the future Louis VII, to marry Eleanor. The young girl had no say in the matter. One day she was mourning her father. The next she was marrying a stranger and becoming Queen of France. The marriage started well enough. Eleanor was vivacious, cultured, and passionate. Louis was pious, reserved, and mild-mannered. For a while, they made it work. Eleanor even accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, an almost unheard-of role for a medieval queen. But the cracks began to show. Eleanor wanted children, specifically sons, but after 15 years, she had produced only 2 daughters. The couple grew apart. Eleanor famously quipped that she had married a monk, not a king. In 1152, they did something almost unheard of in medieval royal circles. They got their marriage annulled. But Eleanor's freedom was short-lived. Just 8 weeks later, she married Henry of Anjou, who soon became King Henry II of England. She was 30. He was 19. This second marriage wasn't entirely forced, but Eleanor had few options as a divorced woman, even one with her wealth and status. With Henry, Eleanor finally had the sons she wanted, 4 of them, along with 5 daughters. But this marriage, too, would become a prison. After she supported her sons' rebellion against their father, Henry kept Eleanor under house arrest for 16 years. Eleanor outlived both her husbands and most of her children, eventually dying at the remarkable age of 82. She had been a queen twice over, but never truly in control of her own destiny. Number 10. Isabella of France. The she-wolf's Can a woman turn the tables on a forced marriage? Isabella of France did just that, but at a terrible cost. Isabella was just 12 years old when she was sent from France to England to marry King Edward II in 1308. The marriage was purely political, aiming to resolve tensions between England and France. The young girl had no choice in the matter. At first, Isabella tried to be a good wife. She gave Edward 4 children, including the future Edward III. But her husband had little interest in her. Edward was widely believed to be in love with his male favorites, first Piers Gaveston, and later Hugh Despenser the Younger. Isabella endured humiliation after humiliation. Edward gave her jewels and properties to Despenser's wife. He reduced her income. He even took away her children and gave them to Despenser's wife to raise. The breaking point came when Edward sent Isabella to France on a diplomatic mission in 1325. There she began an affair with Roger Mortimer, an English baron who had escaped from the Tower of London and was Edward's sworn enemy. Together, Isabella and Mortimer returned to England with an army, deposed Edward, and placed Isabella's 14-year-old son on the throne as Edward III. Edward II was imprisoned and later died under mysterious circumstances. Many believe he was murdered on Isabella and Mortimer's orders. For 3 years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England as regents. but power corrupted them. They executed Edward's favorites, helped themselves to royal treasure, and made enemies of just about everyone. In 1330, the young Edward III staged a coup, had Mortimer executed, and sent his mother into retirement. Isabella lived out the rest of her days in relative comfort, but far from power. Isabella's story shows how a forced marriage could drive a woman to extraordinary acts of rebellion. She went from child, bride to queen, to revolutionary to she-wolf, as later historians called her, to disgraced dowager. Her tragic tale serves as a stark reminder of how women in medieval times could be both victims of the marriage system and occasionally its most ruthless players. Number 9. Catherine of Aragon. 6 years a widow, 7 years a virgin. What happens when you're sent abroad to marry, only to be widowed almost immediately? For Catherine of Aragon, it meant years in limbo, followed by a marriage that would change the course of world history. Catherine was the youngest daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. At just 3 years old, she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne. This wasn't unusual. Royal children were often promised in marriage while still in cradles. At 16, Catherine finally traveled to England for her wedding. She met Arthur for the first time just days before their marriage, in November 1501. The teenage couple were immediately put to bed together in a public bedding ceremony, as was customary for royal marriages. But tragedy struck. Just 5 months into the marriage, Arthur died, possibly from the sweating sickness that was ravaging England. Catherine was a 16-year-old widow in a foreign country where she barely spoke the language. What followed was 6 years of misery. Catherine's value as a political pawn remained, so she wasn't sent home to Spain. Instead, she was kept in England, often in poverty, while her father-in-law, King Henry VII, and her father, King Ferdinand, haggled over her dowry. Eventually, a new plan was hatched. Catherine would marry Arthur's younger brother, the new heir, who would become Henry VIII. The Catholic Church normally forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow, but the Pope granted a special dispensation. The marriage didn't take place until 1509, after Henry VII died and Henry VIII became king. Catherine was 23 and had spent 7 years in a strange kind of limbo. Not quite English, not quite Spanish, not quite married, not quite single. Initially, the marriage seemed happy. Catherine wrote to her father that Henry was the best husband a woman could want. But when she failed to provide a male heir, despite multiple pregnancies, only daughter Mary survived. Henry's eye began to wander. We all know what happened next. Henry became infatuated with Anne Boleyn and decided his marriage to Catherine had been cursed because she had been his brother's wife. He sought an annulment. When the Pope refused, Henry broke with Rome, established the Church of England, and divorced Catherine anyway. Catherine spent her final years essentially under house arrest, separated from her daughter, insisting until her death that she was the king's true wife. From child, bride, to widow, to queen, to divorcee, Catherine's life was shaped at every turn by marriages she had no say in arranging. Number 8. Lucrezia Borgia, the Pope's daughter and political pawn. Would you believe that one of history's most infamous women was married 3 times by age 22? Each time to serve her family's political ambitions. Lucrezia Borgia's life reads like a Renaissance soap opera, but for her, it was a brutal reality. Lucrezia was born in 1480, the illegitimate daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI. Being the Pope's daughter made her an invaluable political asset in the complex world of Italian politics. Her first marriage was arranged when she was just 11. The groom was Giovanni Sforza, a 27-year-old nobleman from Milan. The match was made to secure an alliance between the Borgias and the powerful Sforza family. But politics shifted. By 1497, the Borgias no longer needed the Sforza alliance. Pope Alexander VI decided to annul Lucrezia's marriage, claiming it had never been consummated, despite the couple having lived together as husband and wife for 4 years. Giovanni Sforza was understandably furious. He claimed the real reason for the annulment was that the Pope wanted Lucrezia for himself, accusing Alexander VI of incest. This accusation would haunt Lucrezia for the rest of her life, though historians find no credible evidence for it. The annulment went through, and Lucrezia was soon married off again, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, the 17-year-old illegitimate son of the King of Naples. This marriage was again for political gain, as the Borgias now sought an alliance with Naples. Lucrezia may have actually loved Alfonso, and the couple had a son together. But once again, political winds changed, and the Borgias now viewed Naples as an enemy. Alfonso was attacked in the streets of Rome, and while recovering from his wounds in Lucrezia's care, he was strangled to death, likely on the orders of Lucrezia's brother, Cesare. At 20, Lucrezia was a widow with a young son. Her grief was cut short, however, as her father, the Pope, was already arranging her third marriage, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. This final marriage lasted until Lucrezia's death at age 39. While it began as yet another political arrangement, Lucrezia eventually found her place in Ferrara. She became a respected patron of the arts and was known for her charitable works. Lucrezia's life shows how even women at the highest levels of Renaissance society were treated as property to be traded for political advantage. She endured 3 marriages before she was even out of her early 20s, each one arranged without her consent, each one ending or beginning according to her family's changing political needs. Number 7. Margaret Beaufort, the child mother who birthed a dynasty. Can you imagine giving birth at 13? For Margaret Beaufort, this traumatic experience was just the beginning of a life shaped by forced marriages and political machinations. Margaret became a valuable marriage prospect the moment she was born in 1443. As the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, she had a distant claim to the English throne. She was also incredibly wealthy, inheriting vast estates from her father who died before she was 1 year old. Her first marriage was arranged when she was just 1 year old to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. This marriage was later dissolved, but it set the pattern for how Margaret's life would unfold as a pawn in the marriage market. At age 12, Margaret was married to Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. The marriage was consummated immediately, despite Margaret's youth. Edmund died of plague just months after the wedding, leaving Margaret 7 months pregnant at age 13. Margaret nearly died, giving birth to her son, Henry Tudor, on January 28, 1457. The birth was so difficult that she never conceived again despite 2 subsequent marriages. Doctors told her the trauma to her young body had made further pregnancies impossible. With a baby son who had a claim to the throne, albeit a distant one, Margaret was once again a valuable marriage prospect. She soon married Sir Henry Stafford, a match arranged by her brother-in-law, the new king's protector. When Stafford died in 1471, Margaret, now 28, had more say in her third marriage to Thomas Stanley. This union proved politically shrewd. Stanley was a powerful nobleman who eventually helped Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, making Henry King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. Throughout these marriages, Margaret remained focused on one thing: advancing her son's interests. She was separated from Henry for much of his childhood, as he was raised in Wales and later fled to Brittany during the Wars of the Roses. But she worked tirelessly behind the scenes, negotiating, plotting, and planning for his eventual rise to power. Once Henry became king, Margaret, now styled My Lady, the king's mother, wielded enormous influence. She never took religious vows but lived separately from her husband Stanley in a quasi-monastic state, devoting herself to education, religion, and maintaining her son's hold on power. Margaret's story is one of trauma and resilience. Married off as a child, a mother at 13, widowed 3 times, and separated from her only child for years, she nevertheless managed to shape English history through sheer determination. She died in 1509, just months after her son having lived to see her grandson crowned as Henry VIII. Number 6. Constance of Brittany, imprisoned by her husband for giving birth to a daughter. What happens when your husband locks you away because you gave birth to a girl instead of a boy? For Constance of Brittany, this nightmare scenario was all too real. Constance was born around 1161, the daughter and heiress of Duke Conan IV of Brittany. Her father's position was precarious, and he sought the protection of King Henry II of England. The price? Constance's hand in marriage to Henry's 4th son, Geoffrey. The betrothal was arranged when Constance was still a child. By the time she was 15, her father had died, making her the Duchess of Brittany in her own right. Shortly after, in 1181, she married Geoffrey Plantagenet, who became Duke of Brittany through his marriage to her. The marriage was not a happy one. Geoffrey spent little time in Brittany, preferring the English court and tournaments. Constance, meanwhile, was deeply attached to Brittany and resented English interference in what she saw as her duchy. In 1186, Constance gave birth to a son, Arthur. Geoffrey was pleased. This boy would ensure the Plantagenet line in Brittany. But just months later, Geoffrey died in a tournament, leaving Constance a widow at 25 with a baby son. As a widow with a young male heir, Constance wielded considerable power. She ruled Brittany as regent for her son and fiercely defended Breton independence against English encroachment. This independence didn't sit well with Geoffrey's father, King Henry II of England. In 1188, Henry forced Constance into a second marriage with Ranulph de Blondeville, Earl of Chester, one of his loyal followers. The goal was clear: to keep Brittany under English control. Ranulph proved to be a cruel husband. When Constance gave birth to a daughter, Alex, rather than the son he had hoped for, Ranulph imprisoned his wife in his castle at Chester. The people of Brittany were outraged by this treatment of their duchess. Constance eventually escaped, or was released from captivity and made her way back to Brittany. There, she effectively ended her marriage to Ranulph by refusing to live with him, though they were never formally divorced. In her final years, Constance continued to rule Brittany and raised her son Arthur to value his Breton heritage. When Richard the Lionheart, who had succeeded Henry II, died in 1199, Constance supported Arthur's claim to the English throne against Richard's brother John. Constance died in 1201, at about age 40, likely from leprosy. Her son Arthur continued the fight for the English throne, but was captured by King John and disappeared while in captivity. Most historians believe John had him murdered. Constance's life illustrates the precarious position of even the highest-ranking women in medieval society. Despite being a duchess in her own right, she was forced into marriages that served the political interests of men imprisoned for not producing a male heir in her second marriage, and ultimately unable to protect her son from the deadly power politics of the Plantagenet family. Number 5. Ingeborg of Denmark. The queen rejected on her wedding night. Can you imagine being rejected by your husband on your wedding night, then spending 20 years fighting to be recognized as his wife? This was the fate of Ingeborg of Denmark, one of medieval history's most mistreated queens. Ingeborg was born a princess of Denmark around 1175. At 18, she was sent to France to marry King Philip II Augustus, who had been widowed a year earlier. The marriage was arranged to cement an alliance between France and Denmark against England. The wedding took place on August 14, 1193. According to chroniclers, everything seemed fine during the ceremony, but the very next morning, something mysterious happened. After the wedding night, Philip appeared visibly disturbed. He immediately sought to have the marriage annulled, claiming the marriage had not been consummated due to some sort of witchcraft that made him unable to perform sexually. Ingeborg, who didn't yet speak French, had no idea what was happening. She was whisked away from court and housed in various convents, while Philip convened a council of French bishops to annul the marriage. When Ingeborg finally understood what was happening, she cried out, "Mala Francia! Mala Francia! Roma! Roma!" "Evil France! Evil France! Rome! Rome!" appealing to the Pope to intervene. The exact reason for Philip's sudden rejection remains one of history's mysteries. Some historians suggest he found her physically repugnant, others that there was some sexual dysfunction, while still others believe Philip had simply gotten what he wanted from the Danish alliance and no longer needed the marriage. Pope Celestine III declared the annulment invalid, but Philip ignored him. He kept Ingeborg virtually imprisoned, while he married again to Agnes of Merania. Ingeborg appealed to successive popes, her brother King Canute VI of Denmark, and anyone else who might help her cause. Ingeborg's ordeal continued for 2 decades. She was moved from convent to convent, sometimes kept in conditions so harsh that she lacked proper food and clothing. Philip offered her money to agree to an annulment, but she steadfastly refused. The situation finally changed when Pope Innocent III placed France under interdict in 1198 because of Philip's bigamous marriage to Agnes. This meant no church services could be held in France, no masses, no weddings, no Christian burials. The pressure on Philip became intense. Agnes died in 1201, possibly from the stress of the situation. Philip, still unwilling to return to Ingeborg, spent several more years trying to get the marriage annulled on various grounds, all rejected by the Pope. Finally, in 1213, after 20 years of separation, Philip reinstated Ingeborg as queen. His motivations were likely political. He needed papal support for his son's claim to the English throne. There's no evidence they ever lived as husband and wife, but Ingeborg finally received the recognition and royal treatment she deserved. When Philip died in 1223, Ingeborg was well provided for in his will. She lived out her days in dignity, dying around 1237 to 1238 at about 60 years old. Her 2-decade struggle against one of Europe's most powerful monarchs stands as a testament to extraordinary resilience in the face of humiliation and injustice. Number 4. Empress Matilda. The woman who would be king. What happens when a woman is raised to rule, but the men around her refuse to accept it? Empress Matilda's life was defined by this struggle, including a marriage that changed the course of English history. Born in 1102, Matilda was the daughter of King Henry I of England and his wife Edith of Scotland. At just 8 years old, she was sent to Germany to marry the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V, who was 24 years her senior. The match was prestigious, as Empress Matilda outranked almost every woman in Europe. For 10 years, Matilda lived in Germany, learning governance at her husband's side. She served as regent when he was away on campaigns, gaining valuable experience in ruling. But in 1125, Emperor Henry died without children, and the 23-year-old Matilda returned to England. Her father had a new plan for her. Henry I's only legitimate son had drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, leaving the king without a male heir. Determined that his daughter should succeed him, Henry made his nobles swear an oath to accept Matilda as England's ruler after his death. But first, she needed to marry again and produce heirs. Henry chose Geoffrey of Anjou, a strategic ally but problematic in several ways. He was 11 years younger than Matilda. She was 25, he was 14. Of lower rank than her previous husband, and the Angevins were traditional enemies of the Normans who ruled England. Matilda resisted the match, but eventually submitted to her father's will. The marriage was deeply unhappy from the start. Geoffrey found Matilda haughty and imperious. She found him immature and beneath her station. They separated for several years before reconciling and eventually having 3 sons, including the future Henry II of England. When King Henry I died in 1135, everything fell apart. Despite the oaths they had sworn, many English nobles balked at having a woman ruler. Matilda's cousin Stephen seized the throne while she was in Anjou, pregnant with her 3rd child. What followed was a period known as the Anarchy, nearly 2 decades of civil war as Matilda fought for her rightful crown. She invaded England in 1139 and captured Stephen in 1141, briefly controlling the government. But her arrogant demeanor alienated the citizens of London who drove her from the city before she could be crowned. Matilda never became Queen Regnant of England, though she came tantalizingly close. The war dragged on until 1153, when a compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king for life, but Matilda's son Henry would succeed him. When Stephen died the following year, Henry II took the throne, founding the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for over 300 years. In her later years, Matilda returned to Normandy, where she wielded considerable influence as the mother of the king. She died in 1167 at age 65, having lived a life that spanned from forced bride to empress to almost queen to power behind the throne. Matilda's story shows how medieval women, even those of royal blood raised to rule, were ultimately subject to male authority when it came to marriage and succession. Her forced marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou, while unhappy, ultimately produced the heir who would fulfill her claim to England's throne, though she herself would never wear the crown. Number 3. Joan of England, the 11-year-old bride of Sicily. What's it like to be sent across a continent to marry a man you've never met, in a land where you don't speak the language? For Joan of England, this journey began when she was just a child. Joan was born in 1165, the 7th child of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her early childhood coincided with the height of her parents' power, but also with the increasing tensions in their marriage. By the time Joan was 7, her mother, Eleanor, had been imprisoned by Henry for supporting their son's rebellion against him. Despite the family drama, Joan's value as a diplomatic pawn remained high. In 1176, when Joan was 11, ambassadors arrived from Sicily with a proposal. King William II, known as William the Good, wanted Joan as his bride. William was 22. Already a king in his own right, and ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe. The English royal council quickly approved the match. Sicily was strategically important, sitting at the crossroads of Christian Europe and the Muslim Mediterranean. An alliance through marriage would strengthen England's international position. Joan had no say in the matter. She was placed in the care of Rotrou, Archbishop of Rouen, and John of Oxford, Bishop of Norwich, who would escort her across Europe to her new home. The journey was arduous, taking 4 months to travel from England through France and Italy to Sicily. In February 1177, Joan finally arrived in Palermo. William had never seen his bride before, but was apparently pleased with what he saw. The couple were married on February 13th, and Joan was crowned Queen of Sicily. William's kingdom was a fascinating melting pot of cultures. Norman, Greek, Arab, and Jewish communities all coexisted there. The court was one of the most sophisticated in Europe, known for its art, science, and literature. For Joan, it must have been an overwhelming change from the Norman court of England. Despite the cultural differences, the marriage seems to have been relatively successful. William treated Joan with respect, giving her her own lands and household. However, the union produced no children during their 11 years together. Tragedy struck in November 1189, when William died unexpectedly at age 36. Joan, now 24, was vulnerable in a kingdom where she was still an outsider. William's cousin Tancred seized the throne and also Joan's dower lands, which should have provided her income as a widow. Joan appealed to her brother, now King Richard I of England, who was passing through Sicily on his way to the Third Crusade. Richard demanded Tancred return Joan's properties and pay an enormous indemnity. When Tancred hesitated, Richard's forces attacked and captured Messina. Tancred eventually agreed to Richard's terms. Joan did not return to England, but instead accompanied her brother on crusade. In the Holy Land, Richard arranged another marriage for her to Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. This match was again for political reasons to secure English interests in southern France. This second marriage produced 2 children, but was not happy. Raymond was reportedly abusive and had been excommunicated for supporting the Cathar heresy. Joan fled from her husband while pregnant with her second child, seeking refuge at her brother Richard's court in Rouen. In 1199, while traveling to Fontevraud Abbey, Joan went into labor at Rouen Castle. She gave birth to her child, who died shortly after, and Joan herself died of complications from childbirth. She was just 33 years old. Joan's remains were buried at Fontevraud Abbey, where her mother, Eleanor, and brother Richard would later join her. Her life, from child bride to widowed queen to unhappy second wife, illustrates how royal women were moved around Europe like chess pieces, their personal happiness secondary to political advantage. Number 2, Margaret of Austria. 3 times betrothed, twice widowed by 24. Can you imagine being sent away from your parents at 3 years old to marry a foreign prince? What about being widowed, remarried, and widowed again before your 24th birthday? For Margaret of Austria, this wasn't imagination, but harsh reality. Born in 1480 as the daughter of Maximilian of Habsburg, later Holy Roman Emperor, and Mary of Burgundy, Margaret's life as a political pawn began almost immediately. At just 3 years old, she was betrothed to the future King Charles VIII of France and sent to the French court to be raised as a future queen. For the next 10 years, Margaret lived in France, learning French customs and language separated from her family. Then, in a cruel twist, Charles VIII rejected her in favor of a more advantageous match with Anne of Brittany in 1491. The 11-year-old Margaret was unceremoniously returned to her father's court, humiliated on the international stage before she was even a teenager. But Margaret remained valuable on the marriage market. In 1497, at age 17, she married Juan, Prince of Asturias, the heir to the Spanish throne. The marriage was part of a dual alliance. Her brother Philip married Juan's sister, Joanna, at the same time. The young couple were reportedly besotted with each other. But happiness was short-lived. Just 6 months into the marriage, Juan died suddenly, possibly from tuberculosis. The newly widowed Margaret was pregnant, but soon suffered a stillbirth, losing her child and her position as future Queen of Spain in one devastating blow. Back to her father's court went Margaret, and soon another marriage was arranged. In 1501, she wed Philibert II, Duke of Savoy. This third marriage was reportedly a happy one, but again tragedy struck. After just 3 years of marriage, Philibert died of pneumonia in 1504. Margaret, now 24, refused to marry again. "Fortune has struck me 3 blows in my youth," she later wrote. First, my betrothal to the King of France was dissolved. Then my husband, the Prince of Spain, was taken from me by death, and now I have also lost my Duke of Savoy. I shall never marry again. She kept her word, though many suitors were proposed over the years, including King Henry VII of England and King Louis XII of France. Instead of remarrying, Margaret devoted herself to politics and culture. Her father appointed her governor of the Habsburg Netherlands, ruling on behalf of her young nephew, the future Emperor Charles V. In this role, she proved herself an astute diplomat and capable ruler. Margaret's court at Mechelen became a center of art and learning. She was a patron to musicians and artists, including the famous painter Albrecht Dürer. She collected books, tapestries, and paintings, and commissioned a magnificent church and funerary monument for herself and her second husband, Philibert. Throughout her life, Margaret maintained a wry perspective on her marital misfortunes. Legend has it that after nearly drowning in a shipwreck, she composed her own epitaph. Here lies Margaret, who had fortune enough to be thrice married, and yet died a virgin. Though this is likely apocryphal, it captures her reputed wit and resilience. Margaret died in 1530, at the age of 50, having never remarried after her third marriage ended. Her life exemplifies how noble women were treated as diplomatic currency, sent across Europe as children to cement political alliances with little regard for their happiness or well-being. Number 1. Bianca Maria Sforza, the beautiful bride who died of neglect. Did you know that being an empress could be a death sentence? Would you believe that one of Renaissance Italy's most beautiful women was married off to a man 3 decades her senior, only to die young, neglected, and far from home? Bianca Maria Sforza was born in 1472 to Duke Galeazzo Maria Sforza of Milan and his second wife, Bona of Savoy. Her early life was marked by tragedy. Her father was assassinated when she was just 4 years old, throwing the Duchy of Milan into political turmoil. Bianca's uncle, Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, eventually seized power as regent for her young half-brother. Ludovico saw Bianca as a valuable political asset. When she was just 5 years old, he betrothed her to her first cousin, Maximilian Sforza, to strengthen his own claim to power in Milan. This engagement was later broken, and at age 16, Bianca was married to another relative, Duke Philibert, the first of Savoy. The marriage was brief. Philibert died of an accident just months later, making Bianca a widow before she turned 17. Back to Milan she went, where her uncle Ludovico had an even more ambitious plan for her. In 1493, Ludovico arranged for the now 21-year-old Bianca to marry Maximilian I of Habsburg, King of the Romans and future Holy Roman Emperor. Maximilian was 44, a widower with grown children, including Philip the Handsome, who was actually older than his new stepmother Bianca. The marriage was purely political. Ludovico Sforza wanted imperial recognition of his rule in Milan. Maximilian needed the enormous dowry of 400,000 ducats that came with Bianca. Contemporary accounts describe Bianca as exceptionally beautiful, with golden hair, a graceful figure, and elegant manners. A portrait by Ambrogio de Predis shows a young woman with delicate features and an air of innocence. But beauty and wealth weren't enough to make her marriage a happy one. Bianca traveled to Innsbruck for the wedding, which took place on March 16, 1494. From the beginning, the marriage was troubled. Maximilian was frequently absent, engaged in wars and imperial politics. When he was present, he showed little interest in his young wife, preferring hunting and scholarly pursuits to her company. The language barrier didn't help. Bianca spoke Italian and some French. Maximilian spoke German and Latin. Court records suggest they could barely communicate. Isolated in a foreign court, unable to speak the language and neglected by her husband, Bianca grew increasingly unhappy. She wrote letters to her family in Milan, expressing her loneliness. She never managed to conceive a child, further diminishing her status at court. Meanwhile, Maximilian had little use for her. Once he had secured her dowry, he spent the money on wars and rarely visited her. When political winds changed and Ludovico Sforza was driven from power in Milan in 1500, Bianca's value to Maximilian decreased even further. The final years of Bianca's life were bleak. Records indicate she may have suffered from depression. She developed what some historians believe was an eating disorder, either anorexia or bulimia. Her health deteriorated rapidly. In 1510, at just 38 years old, Bianca died at Innsbruck. The cause was recorded as mal di stomaco, stomach illness, but many believe she essentially died of neglect and unhappiness. She was buried without ceremony, and Maximilian did not attend her funeral. Bianca's tragic story illustrates the extreme vulnerability of women in Renaissance politics. Despite her beauty, wealth, and noble birth, she was treated as nothing more than a transaction. Married 3 times for political advantage, she spent her final years alone in a foreign land, her health broken, her value to her husband reduced to the dowry she had brought him years before. Would you sacrifice your life for a political alliance? How many young women throughout history were forced to do exactly that? The echoes of these medieval marriages continue to resonate today, reminding us of the human cost of power politics across the centuries.